I'm going to talk about another project. Again, I think Tom mentioned this earlier. This is something that we've been working on with ACOM for the last 2 years. It's coming to an end. It's really about what do you do in Jeddah, where there's a city which is forecast to grow by about 3 million people in the next 20 years. They're expecting an increase of employment of an extra million-ish as well. What do you do with a city that has grown rapidly over the last probably 40, 50 years? Now, I think partly in recognition of the problems that the city has been through and the way that it's grown more recently, the municipality set up the project as a series of integrated plans across scales. So there was the idea to create a sub-regional plan, which is where does the growth happen within the region? A structure plan, what happens within the city and how does the city accommodate this growth? And then a series of local plans, which is actually what happens on the ground and what happens at the small scale. So I think Tom mentioned a lot of these points, which you can see from just travelling around Jeddah. The way that the city has developed is that it has been done, it might not necessarily be because it's been done top down, but one of the big issues is the way that it has happened as a completely uncoordinated set of decisions, and there's been no understanding of the impact of one set of decisions at a different scale. So if you take things like the roads, it might now be possible to drive from the bottom of Jeddah to the top of Jeddah at 100 miles an hour, but it's not possible to cross the road over here to go and see the guy who lives opposite. So these decisions have been made only looking at the scale of the city without looking at the local impact on the people that live there. So feeding this back into the plan, in terms of starting to address it, one of the things that we need to start to do is actually have a way of understanding the city and being able to link macro scale changes or changes to the city down to local scale impact, and to be able to see what happens if we put this motorway here, what does that mean for everybody who lives here. Now we have at the spatial modelling that we use as the kind of heart of our approach, we're able to analyse that across lots of different scales. So we can make a model of a region, we can analyse it at the scale of the region, we can see what's most connected, where is the centre of the region, but we can also analyse it to see what happens at the smaller scale. Where are the centres which are easier for pedestrians to walk around, and where are the kind of local intensifications within that wider spatial network? So we have the core of a methodology to start to be able to look at the way that these different scales interact with each other and are affected by each other. Now the key elements of the plan that we're looking at are, there's a public transport element, and there's also big changes in population and employment. So we've developed the methodology slightly more than we often use, and we've started to include public transport networks. We've started to be able to take data on population and actually assign that within the city, so we can see what happens, push up the population in this area, what does that do to everywhere else, where are more people moving, where are the centres that emerge within the city. So we have a methodology where we can link different scale impacts, we can link the different parameters of the plan, concentrating on public transport, population and employment. Now we can use this methodology partly as part of the design process, work with the design team and make sure that it develops in the way that it needs to. But we can also use it as a way of benchmarking and assessing options against each other and providing an evidence base to back up decisions which are made at higher level. Now we've got a methodology, we know what the problems are, we know that we need to distribute population within the city. The approach within the team was that population and employment should be concentrated within centres. Now these would be mixed-use centres, well connected to each other with public transport. So the question really becomes, how do you work out where these centres should go within the city? Now we know that from looking at cities that have grown over time and have had time to develop and kind of settle down, which tend to be the more organic ones, the places where the centres are, the places which are focuses of commercial activity and really the kind of hearts of the city, are the places which are well connected to the rest of the city, but they're also the places which have intensified pedestrian networks. And it's this overlap between the way the different networks come together and the opportunities that makes for different users from different places to mix that creates the conditions that support centres. Now we know in Jeddah, if you look at Jeddah, it does the exact opposite. You can see that the red lines in here are the ones which are really important at the scale of the city. This is what the red lines look like. The motorways, they might have big kind of headquarter-y type offices either side, but they don't develop the characteristics of centres. They're very long and they're linear. You don't get any pedestrian activity. It's impossible to cross the road. If you analyse the city using the same model at a smaller scale, the really intensified pedestrian networks that come out are the heart of the unplanned settlements. And these are the bits which have got all of the social problems. They're isolated from the wider city. They have their own local economy and local communities, but they operate almost in isolation from the wider city. So the experience we can see there's a problem in Jeddah, which kind of supports the understanding that we have from the more established places, that to get centres in the right places, you need to create this overlap of connectivity or accessibility. So we've now got an approach and a methodology to start to develop a plan and a design. Within the idea of distributing centres, there was a hierarchy of centres where you have bigger centres, but town centres which would accommodate much higher populations, much higher levels of employment. That then feeds down to multi-district centres, district centres, and down to neighbourhood and local. We had a whole set of parameters for identifying and assessing the best locations in the city for where these centres should go. Now, if we start at the highest level with the town centres, we can see we've identified a number of potential opportunities. These have really come from being big vacant sites which can be developed. Now, the town centres are so big that they're going to create an impact on the wider structure of the city. So what we're looking for in finding the best of these locations is something that's connected to the wider city as strongly as possible. And we can always intensify that through the design of these areas. So we've identified those locations. We look at them to see how accessible they are to the rest of the city. We've then looked at them in terms of how much vacant land is available. And based on these characteristics, we've got a preferred set of town centres which are in red. Once those have been fixed, we look at connecting them together through a public transport network. Now, that public transport network, because of the practicalities of building that later in an existing city, to some extent it needs to follow the existing spatial network or the existing network of streets. So there's a public transport network which links the town centres to each other. We have then taken all of the points along here that could be potential locations for multi-district centres, which are these black dots, and we have looked at what their spatial characteristics are. So we've taken these, we've looked at an area which is about a 10-minute walk from each of these dots, and we've looked at how well connected they are to the wider city, but how well connected they are locally as well. So where you get this overlap in conditions that really support centres. So we've then also looked at how much vacant land is there. Vacant land is not the key to where these centres go, but it means that maybe it's a centre which can be implemented in a different way, or it's something that develops slightly differently to one which is in an already dense area. So we narrow that down to a set of preferred locations, move down to the district centres. Again, we run through the same process. There's all of these potential locations for them along the public transport alignments. We look at the spatial characteristics, look at the vacant land, and we then have a set of preferred locations. Now, so far, this has all been things which have fed into a design process, and the outcome of that design process should be that centres are where there's more people, there's more jobs. They're in the places which are easiest to get to from the rest of the city, and they're better connected to each other. But actually extracting these outcomes and explaining it to either stakeholders or explaining it outside of the team of kind of technical expertise becomes a difficult issue and becomes more difficult. Because in the model we have linked people to jobs, and we've got public transport, and we've got spatial networks, what we can actually do is we can start to talk about the benefits in terms of what it means for people who live in bits of the city. Now, what this is doing is taking all of the points in the city, and it's working out how many centres are within 15 minutes of where I live, and that could be through any mode of transport. The reason that's important is because centres are where there are employment opportunities, education opportunities, health facilities. But what we can do is we can start to look at different options, and we can say, what does that mean for the city? What does it mean for the people who live there? Does this increase the number of opportunities they have or not? We can show that as a map, which is quite a useful way of looking at things, but we can also extract it into a graph as well. And this is the type of thing which is really useful for talking to somebody like the mayor, where we've got 5 options shown on here. Along this axis, we've got the number of centres in 15 minutes. This axis is the proportion of the population. You can use this straight away to say, okay, this option, more people have got more centres within 15 minutes. All the way down through the proportion of residents, more of them can access these opportunities. Now, we can repeat these for things like access to public transport. But we've got something which is a tool that can feed into a design process, but it's also something that can feed into an option assessment and a benchmarking exercise to make sure that we're getting the best for the city. Now, so far, a lot of these issues have been still looking at kind of top-down issues, and it's how you distribute things through the city and looking at a big scale still. The next thing is, what does it actually mean to zoom in? If this is an area that's identified for a centre, you need to get an additional 20,000 people living in here, you need to get 5,000 extra jobs. How is that going to work? I think partly one of the advantages of using the model that we have is that we can zoom in and we can start to rerun the kind of local scale analyses, and we can see what it actually means on the ground. It's partly about testing what the impact is if you increase these populations, but it's also about looking at how the area works at the moment, identifying what the problems are and what the opportunities are. So we can see that there are particular local issues to do with pedestrian permeability, the block sizes. The plots have been coloured according to how long it takes to walk around them. So this area that we're proposing a centre, these blocks are very difficult to walk around, which is not what you want in the heart of a centre. There's also an unplanned settlement, which is just down here. This road is one of those enormous motorways, and so is this. Now, this unplanned settlement, if it can connect into this centre, that's going to give it a huge opportunity for regeneration. But at the moment, it's just not making the most of that location. So again, we're able to zoom in at the smaller scale into the settlement itself, look at the structure that's there, look at how the spaces connect to each other, work out which of if we put a station up here, increase the density and connect this to the wider city, what does that mean in terms of changing the structure and changing the activity within these streets? Where are the bits of this settlement that are working at the moment and that we could keep? Where are the bits that need to be improving? Now, based on this process, we can create a set of improvement plans for these areas which can kind of tag onto the back of the growth which is going to occur in the centres anyway. Now, this is something which is, it's in comparison to Maurice's talk, this is something which has been talking about very spatial and physical characteristics, but it gives you the basis, it gives you an objective starting point to begin to start to look at some of these areas and to begin to have conversations and to engage with local communities and local residents to say, this is what we think the effect of this centre is going to be on this area. We think that you need to improve this street or make these changes. What are the other things that we should be doing at the same time? And it provides you with a framework to really be able to link local scale changes with the impact of the city and to feed up and really get the two things working together. Now, I think that kind of the key thing from this has been the fact that we have the integrated model, that we're coordinating space, we've got a way of analysing it at different scales, feeding in changes to population, changes to employment, public transport. We have a framework that allows each of these levels of plan to start to talk to each other, and the spatial model really acts to negotiate between the impact of kind of regional and citywide changes on the local structure of the areas and allow them to respond and make the most of those opportunities. And I think that's really, I think the one key thing this is doing is really trying to get over this issue that the way that things have happened in the past have been uncoordinated. The impact haven't been understood. And as a result of that, the infrastructure previously only did one thing. This is really allowing things to be more than just a motorway. It becomes a street, and it becomes something that allows people to mix. It becomes a centre. And I think that's the kind of really key benefit of this approach, is getting the most out of the infrastructure and the changes that you're making across scales.